There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not walk in waving flags or demand that rooms fall silent. It does not need a loudspeaker or a press release or a carefully worded palace statement dropped into the laps of journalists. This kind of power simply moves, steady, certain, with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once doubted where they stand. Most people in this world will never come close to it. And most people, if they're being honest with themselves, would not recognize it even if they were standing directly in front of it. Princess and has this kind of power. She has had it for most of her 74 years on this earth, quietly building it in the background of a family that generates enough noise, drama, and public spectacle to drown out almost anyone else. While her brothers stumbled through scandals, while marriages collapsed under the weight of cameras and expectations, while an entire generation of royals seemed to lose their footing one by one and simply kept going. She showed up. She did the work. She signed the papers, gave the speeches, attended the engagements, and boarded the planes without complaint, without fanfare, and without a single interview on a Saturday morning television program explaining how hard everything had been for her. She is, by any honest count, the hardest working member of the British royal family. She has been for years. The numbers bear this out every single time someone bothers to tally them. And yet, for all of that, there is something about the way the world talks about Princess, and that does her a quiet disservice. She is described as stern, formidable, old-fashioned, a woman carved from the same granite as the protocol she upholds. People write about her with a mixture of grudging admiration and slight unease, as if they are not quite sure what to do with a woman who simply refuses to perform warmth for the sake of an audience. She does not need your approval. She never has. That is not coldness. That is something far more rare. It is self-possession of the most complete kind. This story begins on a cold Wednesday morning in November 2024 at a grand stone building in the heart of London. But to understand what happened there and why it mattered, you have to go further back. You have to understand the architecture of the institution these women belong to, and you have to understand what it costs a person to move through that institution with grace and authority for more than 5 decades. The British royal family operates on a set of rules so old, so deeply embedded, that most of the people inside it do not even consciously think about them anymore. They have simply absorbed them, the way you absorb the rules of your childhood home. The ones nobody ever spelled out, but which were absolutely real and absolutely enforced. There's an order of precedence that has governed these royals since 1066. It is not a suggestion. It is not a polite guideline. It is the skeleton of every public appearance, every ceremonial moment, every room that any of them walks into together. Who goes first? Who stands where? Who inspects what? Who yields? These rules exist, in part, because they remove ambiguity from situations that could otherwise become deeply uncomfortable. When you belong to a family with this much history, this much wealth, and this much inherited tension between its members, a clear hierarchy is not just tradition. It is conflict prevention. It is the invisible scaffolding that holds public appearances together without anyone needing to have an awkward conversation backstage. But here's the thing about rules, especially very old ones. They're not fixed in the way most people think. They bend very slightly around the context. They flex with the setting. The person who holds the highest rank in the palace does not necessarily hold the highest rank on a university campus or inside a military installation or within the walls of any institution that carries its own authority and its own chain of command. Context matters. And on November 20th, 2024, the context was unmistakably Anne's. The University of London's Foundation Day is one of those events that most people outside academic and royal circles have never heard of, but which carries a weight that insiders feel immediately. It is the day the university marks its establishment by royal charter in 1836. It is the day honorary degrees are conferred on figures of significant cultural and intellectual contribution. It has the gravity of a ceremony that understands its own history, The kind of event where the room itself seems to demand a certain quality of attention from everyone inside it. Princess Anne had served as Chancellor of the University of London since 1981. 43 years. She had watched students graduate, had presided over foundation days, had guided the institution through the kind of slow, grinding changes that large academic bodies experience over decades. She knew every corridor of Senate House. She knew its rhythms, its traditions, its staff. She had built relationships within those walls that stretched back longer than some of the people who would be standing in a room that day had been alive. On this particular foundation day, the university was conferring an honorary doctorate of literature on Queen Camilla in recognition of her long and genuine work in promoting literacy across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth. Camilla had visited schools, libraries, prisons, and workplaces for years, championing reading as something that changes lives, not as a patronizing gesture from a royal, but as a real conviction. The degree was well-earned. The honor was deserved. And the person who would be placing the hood over Camilla's shoulders and presenting her with the certificate was Anne. The irony of that arrangement is not lost on anyone who has spent time thinking about the layers of this family. Camilla Parker Bowles had once, in a different life, been the woman who represented everything most painful about Prince Charles's first marriage. She had been the third presence in a marriage that Diana famously described as crowded. She had been vilified by the public for years, painted as the villain in a love story that the world had been sold as something pure. She had weathered decades of hatred with a composure that, honestly, deserves more credit than it usually gets. She had married Charles in 2005, had taken on the role of Duchess of Cornwall, and had steadily, methodically rebuilt her public standing through years of quiet, consistent work. When Charles became king in September 2022, Camilla became queen consort. And then, in an extraordinary act of public legitimization, Queen Elizabeth II herself had added a codicil to the royal family's arrangements stating her sincere wish that Camilla be known as Queen Camilla when that day came. Queen Camilla, not queen consort, not princess consort. Queen, that was a statement. That was the old institution putting its full weight behind a woman it had once treated as an inconvenience. And in the years since, Camilla had risen into the role with a naturalness that surprised people who had expected her to remain awkward in it forever. She had found her footing. She had found her voice. And she had, by most honest accounts, been good for Charles, good for his health, his humor, his ability to function in a role that is, by its very nature, isolating and exhausting, and had watched all of this from close range. She knew Camilla. She had known her on and off since long before the marriage. Camilla had once briefly dated Andrew Parker Bowles, who later became her husband, who was once connected to, and in the way that young people in aristocratic circles are always, somehow, connected to each other. Anne's world and Camilla's world had overlapped for a long time. And when the BBC had made a documentary about Charles's coronation year in 2023 and had spoken about Camilla with a warmth that was, for Anne, almost effusive. "I've known her a long time, off and on," she had said. Her understanding of her role and how much difference it makes to the king has been absolutely outstanding. This role is not something that she would have been a natural for, but she does it really well. High praise, especially from someone like Anne, who does not waste words. So there was no animosity here. There was no undercurrent of rivalry as the two women arrived together at the University of London Senate House on that November morning. The photographers were there, of course. They're always there. The staff were lined up and waiting. The other honorary degree recipients and their families were gathered inside. The Guard of Honor was assembled and ready for inspection. A formal detail composed of members of the university's Officer Training Corps, Air Squadron, and Royal Naval Unit standing at attention in the courtyard. This is where the morning became something more interesting than a simple ceremony. Before the doctorates were conferred, before the robes and hoods and the careful choreography of academic tradition, there was the inspection of the Guard of Honor. And The person who inspected that guard was not Queen Camilla. It was not Camilla's aide or Camilla's equerry or anyone from Camilla's team. The person who walked that line, who moved past those students in uniform with the authority of someone who has done this 1,000 times in 1,000 different settings, was Princess, and this was not a slight. This was not a power play. This was simply the correct thing, and was the chancellor, and was the host, and was the person with the institutional authority inside this building on this day in this role. And that authority superseded, in this particular context, the general hierarchy that would apply in a different setting. Camilla's team, the aides and advisors who travel with the queen and who manage every detail of her public appearances, did not have a role in the inspection. They did not have a standing in this part of the ceremony. They were, in the most literal sense, guests in a space that belonged to and the photographs from that morning capture something that words almost struggle to contain. There is, and moving along the line of the guard of honor with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture exact, her expression composed and focused. She is not performing authority. She is simply exercising it the way she has always exercised it, without theater, without self-consciousness, without any apparent awareness that a camera is pointed at her. She does not need the camera. She never has. Camilla, standing nearby, watching, she is composed too. She's always composed now. But there is a difference between the composure of someone who is at home in a space and the composure of someone who is graciously present in someone else's space. In those photographs, that difference is quietly visible. This was the moment that people began to pay attention to. Not because it was dramatic. It was not dramatic at all. Not because there was any confrontation or tension. There was none. But because it illustrated something that the casual observer of royal life sometimes forgets. Rank within the royal family is not a single, fixed ladder with one person permanently on every rung above every other person in every situation. It is a more complex, context-dependent thing. And who has been navigating that complexity for longer than most people in this story have been alive, navigated it that morning with the absolute ease of someone who has never once had to look down to check where she was standing. But the inspection of the guard of honor was only the beginning. What happened next, the moment inside Senate House at the door of the room where the ceremony would take place, is a moment that traveled across newspaper front pages and social media feeds and royal commentary programs for days afterward. It is the moment that, in a few seconds of entirely wordless interaction, said more about both women than any interview either of them has ever given. Camilla and arrived at the door together. And Camilla, in a gesture that was clearly genuine and clearly warm, invited and to enter the room first. It was a gracious thing to do. It was a kind thing to do. It was, if you did not know the rules, exactly the sort of thing you would do for the woman who was hosting you, who had built this institution, who was giving you a degree. It felt like the right thing. It felt like courtesy, and smiled. And then she declined. Not rudely, not with a lecture or a correction or even an explanation. Simply a smile and a gesture that said, after you, because you are the queen, and the queen enters first, and that is how it works, and I will not allow even a kind impulse to override what is correct and proper and true. Camilla entered first. The room watched. The cameras caught it. And the moment settled into the record of that day with the quiet, definitive weight of something that had been exactly right. To understand why that small exchange carries so much meaning, you have to understand what it actually represents. It is not about ego. It is not about who is more important. It is about the preservation of an order that both women understand deeply to be bigger than either of them, and was not refusing Camilla's kindness. She was protecting Camilla's position. She was saying without words, you are the queen, and I will not allow your own generosity to inadvertently diminish what that means. Not here, not on my watch, not even for a moment. That is a very particular kind of loyalty. It is the kind that does not make speeches. It does not write books about itself. It does not give interviews explaining how much it sacrificed. It simply acts in the exact moment the action is needed, and then moves on. And The morning was not finished yet. In part one, the ceremony inside Senate House began the way these things always begin, with the slow, deliberate pageantry of a tradition that has been refined over generations to communicate through every detail that what is happening here matters. The robes came out. The hoods were prepared. The academic regalia that looks faintly absurd in photographs and entirely correct in person was arranged with the care that only comes from doing something the same way for over a century. The 5 recipients of honorary degrees that day took their places. And at the center of it all, in a room that had seen kings and prime ministers and Nobel laureates pass through its doors, the 2 most senior women in the British royal family took up their positions. Camilla knelt on a small padded stool, the traditional posture for receiving an honorary degree, and stood before her, the hood in her hands, and she smiled. Not the tight, formal smile of someone performing a duty. A real smile. The smile of someone who has known this woman for most of her life, through all of the years and complications and changes that have passed between them, and who finds something genuinely moving in this particular moment. She draped the hood over Camilla's shoulders. She presented the certificate. She looked at her sister-in-law with what anyone watching could recognize as warmth and respect, and she said what needed to be said, and the room held the moment with the weight it deserved. The photographs from this exchange became some of the most shared royal images of that week. Not because they showed conflict, because they showed something rarer and, in its own way, more interesting. 2 women who understand the world they inhabit, who have both paid significant prices to remain standing within it, sharing a moment of genuine mutual regard inside an institution that tends to chew people up and distribute the pieces across the front pages of tabloid newspapers. But even while those photographs were being taken, even while the ceremony was unfolding with its careful elegance, something else was being noticed. Something quieter. Something that played out not in front of the cameras, but in the margins of the event, in the spaces where the protocol questions were being worked out, where decisions about who stands where and who participates in what were being made by the people whose job it is to make those decisions. Camilla's team had arrived, as they always do, prepared to manage every aspect of the Queen's appearance. This is what they do. This is what every senior royal's household staff does. They liaise with the hosting institution in advance. They go over the schedule. They map the entrances and exits. They brief on photography positions. They know at every moment what is expected and what their principal is supposed to do next. They are, in effect, an invisible infrastructure that allows the visible performance of royalty to function smoothly. At most events, Camilla's team would have a significant degree of authority over how the Queen's portion of the proceedings unfolds. They would work with security and event coordinators to manage access, to control what happens in the immediate space around the Queen, to ensure that the presentation of the monarchy is exactly what it needs to be. That is their professional function. They're good at it. They have to be. But this was not most events. This was the University of London Foundation Day, and the University of London had a chancellor, and the chancellor was Princess, and the chancellor had been running this institution for 43 years. The protocols here, who inspects what, who goes where, who has authority over which portions of the ceremony, were not protocols that Camilla's team had written. They were protocols that had been established and maintained over decades by its office and the university together. The Guard of Honor inspection was the clearest illustration of this. When Camilla's team arrived and began the process of working out the morning's choreography, the question of who would inspect the guard came up. For Camilla's aides, accustomed to events where the Queen's participation is central and comprehensive, the instinct may well have been to include their principal in this portion of the ceremony. A Guard of Honor is a significant gesture. It is composed of young military cadets standing in formation, offering the formal recognition of service. It is the kind of moment that generates good photographs and communicates institutional respect. But here, the answer is already written. It had been written long before Camilla became queen. It had been written in the relationship between the Chancellor's office and the university's officer training corps in the decades of foundation days that had preceded this one, and the standing authority that carried within this institution. The guard would be inspected by the chancellor. The chancellor was Anne. This was not negotiable, and it was not a slight. It was simply the correct operation of institutional authority in its proper context. For Camilla's team, the result was that their role in this particular segment of the morning was defined by the ceremony rather than by them. They did not manage the inspection. They did not position the queen for it. They watched from the margins while and moved through the guard with the practiced ease of someone completely at home in precisely this kind of formal military setting. And was genuinely completely at home. This is worth understanding. Anne's connection to the military is not ceremonial in the way that some royals' connections are. She is not a figurehead who shows up to pin medals and smile for cameras. She served as colonel-in-chief of numerous regiments. She has reviewed troops in dozens of countries, in dozens of contexts, over 50 years. She has the actual earned authority that comes from a working relationship with military institutions, not just a symbolic one. When she walks along a line of cadets at attention, she is not a royal playing dress-up in a military setting. She is a senior figure in a legitimate chain of institutional respect, and the people standing at attention can feel the difference. This is part of what made the morning so legible to the people who were watching carefully. Two women, both of them operating from real authority, but one of them operating from the authority of her title and her household, and the other operating from the authority of the institution itself. And in the place where those two kinds of authority came into contact, the institutional authority held. It would be a mistake to read any of this as tension between and Camilla themselves. The evidence does not support that reading. The way the two women moved through the morning together suggested not rivalry, but rapport, a long-standing familiarity between people who know each other well enough not to need to explain things to each other. When Camilla invited Anne through the door first, she was not testing boundaries. She was expressing genuine warmth for a woman she respects. And when it declined, she was not claiming territory. She was doing what Anne always does, upholding the structure that holds everything else in place, even when it requires her to be the one who holds the line. But the moment passed through the press and the public commentary with a particular energy because it touched something that people have been quietly noticing for years. The question of where Anne stands in the family really stands not just on the line of succession chart, but in terms of actual functional authority and weight, is one that the narrative around the royal family has often fumbled. She ranks below Camilla in the formal hierarchy. She ranks below Charles, below William, below their children. On paper, she is relatively far down the list. And yet, there is something about and that resists that simple accounting. She has been at Charles's side through every significant moment of his reign. She was positioned directly beside him in the official coronation portrait, a choice that was, as royal experts immediately noted, a deliberate statement by Charles about the people he trusts and relies upon most. She carries out more official engagements than almost any other member of the family. She represents the crown in settings and contexts that would tax the stamina of people 30 years younger. She does not complain about any of it, and she does not seek recognition for any of it. When you look at the photographs from that November morning, and in her chancellor's robes, moving with complete authority through a guard of honor, while Camilla's team stood to one side with a significantly reduced role, what you are really looking at is this: the difference between rank on paper and weight in practice. Rank on paper is fixed. It is set by birth order and marriage and the rules of succession and the decisions of a monarch. It does not change based on who does more, who shows up more, who has earned more respect through decades of actual work. The chart says what it says, but weight in practice is earned. It accumulates slowly through years and years of consistency, through the hundreds of times you showed up when it would have been easier not to, through the institutions you built and sustained and protected, through the way people look at you when you walk into a room. Not because of your title, but because of the specific, personal, irreplaceable authority you have built within them. And as both, she has the rank, even if it sits several places below the very top. And she has the weight, the kind that fills a room, that organizes an event around itself, that leaves Camilla's team with a meaningfully diminished role in an inspection that, in almost any other setting, they would have helped to choreograph. To understand what this means, you have to understand something about the history between these two women and this family. There was a time, not so long ago, when Camilla's position in this family was not secure. There was a time when her presence was contested, when her relationship with Charles was the source of genuine public fury, when her path from private mistress to queen consort seemed impossible to many people who were watching. She survived that period. She came through it with her dignity largely intact. She built the life she has now through patience and determination and the kind of stubborn continuity that is in its own way very similar to what and has always done, and never made Camilla's difficult years worse. She was not among the voices of public condemnation. She maintained, throughout, a private and respectful distance that allowed the situation to develop without adding fuel to a fire that was already burning hot enough. And when the time came for Camilla to take her place fully within the institution, and was one of the people who made that easier rather than harder, her public statements of support, when they came, carried real weight precisely because and does not offer them casually. So the dynamic in Senate House on that November morning was not a power struggle between rivals. It was something more complicated and more interesting. It was two women who genuinely respect each other, operating within a set of rules that sometimes place them in the same space with different and occasionally competing kinds of authority, and both of them navigating that with a grace and a mutual consideration that the institution would have wanted if institutions could want things. But the moment with the guard, the moment at the door, the photographs of and moving through the ceremony with complete, unchallenged ownership of the space that was hers, these became symbols of something larger. They became part of a running conversation about its place in the modern monarchy, about the gap between formal rank and functional authority, and about what it looks like when a person who has spent a lifetime building real institutional weight exercises it in a context where no one can reasonably question its legitimacy. The coverage that followed was, in parts, exaggerated. Some outlets framed it as a confrontation that it was not. Some described it as a territorial victory in a war that was not being fought. The reality was quieter and more interesting than that. The reality was a morning that illustrated, without drama or conflict, exactly how the architecture of royal authority actually works when you look at it clearly, not through the lens of tabloid narrative, but through the lens of institutional structure and earned standing. And that architecture, as it turned out, had some things to say. It said that title and context are different things. It said that the person who has spent decades building a real relationship with an institution does not simply step aside from that relationship because a higher-ranking visitor arrives. It said that Camilla's team, however capable and however skilled in the management of royal appearances, did not have standing in the particular space that belonged to Anne, and that this was not a slight against Camilla, but a fact about Anne. And it said something else, something that ran beneath all of it like a current that nobody needed to name, but everyone who was paying attention could feel. It said that Princess and does not rush. She does not perform. She does not make moves. She simply exists fully and completely in the spaces that are rightfully hers, and she exercises her authority there with a steadiness that does not need to raise its voice. And nobody, not Camilla's team, not the photographers, not the commentators who spent the next several days analyzing every photograph from that morning, could find a single reason to argue with any of it. In a part two after the ceremony was over, and the photographs had been taken, and the academic robes had been carefully folded away, the two women posed together. Camilla held her diploma and stood beside her. They were both smiling, genuinely, warmly, in the way of people who have been through enough together that a formal occasion cannot fully contain the ease between them. That image traveled across the world. People saw different things in it, The way people always see different things when they look at photographs of the British royal family. Some saw the photo as evidence of harmony and shared purpose within a monarchy that had weathered more turbulence in the previous decade than in several preceding ones combined. Some saw it as the culmination of a long, complicated journey. Camilla's journey, specifically from the woman the public blamed for everything to the woman standing in doctoral robes next to the king's own sister, holding a degree from one of the oldest universities in the country. Some saw in Anne's expression an acknowledgement of something that could not be reduced to a caption or a headline. The quiet recognition of a woman who has watched this institution change and adapt and survive, and who knows better than most what that surviving actually costs. But the people who had been in Senate House that morning, the people who had watched the full sweep of the event, from the inspection of the Guard of Honor in the courtyard to the moment at the door to the ceremony itself, they had seen something else too. They had seen the machine of institutional authority operating exactly as it was designed to operate. And they had watched Princess and sit at the center of that machine, managing it without visible effort, without apparent ego, with the kind of total command that comes only from a very long and very deep investment in something larger than yourself. The press, of course, found its angle quickly. The headlines arrived. Princess and seizes control. Camilla's team sidelined. The Princess Royal puts protocol first. Guard of Honor moment that said everything about Anne. They were not entirely wrong, these headlines. They had grasped at something real, even if the framing was dressed up in the language of conflict and competition that tabloid coverage cannot quite resist. The thing they had grasped was this. In a family full of competing narratives and shifting power dynamics, Princess Anne had walked through a public event with her authority entirely intact and entirely unambiguous, and that was worth noting. But the fuller story is worth more than the headlines, because the fuller story is about something that takes a lifetime to build and that almost no one in the modern world fully understands how to build anymore. The royal family as an institution is, in some ways, an exercise in the management of inherited authority. Most of its members did not choose to be part of it. Most of them were born into roles that were defined before they took their first breath. The rules were already written. The ceremonies were already rehearsed. The hierarchies were already established. And the question that each person within the institution has to answer over the course of their working life is not whether to accept these structures. There's not much choice about that, but what to do with them. Whether to carry them as a burden or to inhabit them as a genuine expression of something you believe in, and inhabits them. That is the clearest way to put it. She does not carry the protocols of the royal family as if they were chains. She does not perform them with visible resentment or visible fatigue. She inhabits them the way a person inhabits a house they have lived in for 50 years, with total familiarity, with a knowledge of every corner and creak, with an ease that comes not from indifference, but from genuine, settled understanding. She knows why these rules exist. She has seen across decades what happens when they are maintained and what happens when they are not. And she has made her choice. This matters enormously in the context of what happened at the University of London. Because the reason Camilla's team did not have standing in the inspection of the Guard of Honor was not because Anne had maneuvered them out of it. It was because Anne simply occupied the space that was hers completely and without apology, and there was no gap remaining for anyone else to fill. That is not aggression. That is completeness. There's a lesson in that, if you are willing to look for it. The most secure kind of authority is not the kind that needs to push others out of the way to assert itself. It is the kind that fills a space so thoroughly that there is simply nothing left for anyone else to contest, and does not fight for her ground. She stands on it. She has always stood on it. And the ground, over 60 years of consistent, visible, unrelenting presence, has become so firmly hers that the question of whether anyone else might stand on it instead does not really arise. Camilla's team had not anticipated the specific contours of that morning because, perhaps, they had not fully accounted for what it means to walk into a space that belongs to someone who has spent 43 years building it. In most royal engagements, The Queen's household staff can expect to be managing the central presence in the room. But Anne's University of London was not most royal engagements. It was a specific institutional context with a specific authority structure, and that authority structure placed, and at the top of it, regardless of what the line of succession or the royal household charts might say about the general hierarchy of the family. This is a distinction that sounds technical until you see it play out in real life. And when you do see it play out in the photographs of and moving along the Guard of Honor while Camilla and her team stood to one side, it is not technical at all. It is utterly human and completely clear. One person owns this space. One person has earned the right to be the center of this particular ceremony. And everyone present, including the Queen herself, understood that and deferred to it. The fact that Camilla deferred graciously is worth saying explicitly. She did not resist. She did not push back. She did not allow her household staff to create friction around the question of who inspects what or who enters first. She arrived at the University of London as a guest, a very distinguished guest, a guest who would be leaving with a doctorate and whose place in the family sits above Anne's in the general accounting, but a guest nonetheless. And she conducted herself with the self-awareness and the grace of someone who understands the difference between authority you carry with you and authority that belongs to a place. That, too, is its own kind of strength. The ability to enter someone else's institutional space and operate within it on that space's terms, without requiring the space to reorganize itself around you, is not weakness. It is a form of intelligence, a social and institutional intelligence that Camilla has been developing, arguably, since the moment she married Charles and found herself navigating the labyrinthine internal politics of a family that is simultaneously the most public institution in the United Kingdom and one of the most private. She has learned. Visibly, measurably, she has learned. The Camilla who arrived at Senate House in November 2024 was not the Camilla who married Charles in a quiet civil ceremony in 2005, uncertain of her reception and walking a line so narrow it barely existed. She was a woman who had spent 19 years inside this institution, who had watched it from the inside and been watched by it, who had built genuine relationships within it, including with a woman now standing beside her in academic robes, and who had earned her place not just in the succession documents, but in the actual, practical, day-to-day functioning of the monarchy. But earning your place does not mean claiming every space. And in the space of the University of London, on Foundation Day 2024, the space belonged to Anne. What happened in the days that followed the event was instructive in its own way. The coverage, initially excitable and framed around the language of palace intrigue and power plays, gradually settled into something more measured. Royal commentators and historians who actually understood the institutional context began to explain what had happened, not as a battle between two women, but as the correct functioning of a system that distinguishes between general precedents and specific institutional authority. The Guard of Honor inspection was a university function, governed by university protocol, and the Chancellor of the university is the person who performs it. Full stop. No drama. No maneuvering. Just the rules. But the rules had made a picture, and the picture had traveled, and the picture, whatever else it showed Princess and at the center of her domain, operating with the authority of someone who has never needed to be told where she stands. This is ultimately what this story is about. It is not really about Camilla's team losing a privilege, though they did, or rather, they arrived at an event expecting a certain degree of authority over the proceedings and found that the authority over those specific proceedings belonged somewhere else. It is not really about Anne versus Camilla, because there was no contest between them. They left the building that day apparently as fond of each other as they have always been. It is not really even about protocol, though protocol is the mechanism through which everything played out. It is about what it looks like when a person has spent a lifetime doing the unglamorous, essential, grinding work of building something real. When they have shown up year after year, not because the cameras were watching or because the public was applauding or because anyone was paying particular attention, but because the work needed doing and they were capable of doing it, and they understood deeply that consistency is its own form of power and has carried out, depending on the year, somewhere between 400 and 500 official engagements annually. She has done this for decades. She has done it through personal difficulty and political turbulence and the kind of family drama that would have sent most people into retreat. She does not have round-the-clock security. She does not have the constant spotlight that follows Charles and William and Camilla. She does not generate the kind of headline-ready moments that keep royal correspondents in business. She does the work, and she comes home, and then occasionally an event like Foundation Day 2024 comes along, and the work materializes. The decades of presence, the relationships built over 43 years within a single institution, the absolute settled command of an authority earned rather than simply inherited, it all shows up in a single morning, in the way a woman moves through a line of cadets, in the way a door is opened, and the person who should go through it first walks through it first. No speech was made. No statement was issued. No one from his office released a quote about the significance of the guard of honor or the meaning of the door moment. And it does not work that way. The work speaks or it doesn't, and has long since stopped worrying about which. It spoke. What it said was this: there's a kind of royalty that is performed and a kind that is lived. There's a kind of authority that rests on the title alone and a kind that rests on the title and everything the person has built inside it. There is a kind of presence in an institution that is a visit and a kind that is a homecoming. For Camilla, the University of London was an honor, a real one, well-deserved, marking decades of genuine literary advocacy. She accepted it with grace and with the warmth she has cultivated over years of public life. She will remember the morning fondly, almost certainly. The degree sits in whatever room she has put it in at Clarence House or Windsor, and it represents something real about the work she has done. The University of London was something else entirely. It was home. It was the institution she has tended and protected and served for nearly half a century. It was the place where her authority is not borrowed from her family position, but built from her own 43-year investment. And when she walked through that door, when she moved along that guard of honor, when she smiled and declined to enter the room before her guest and her queen, she was not making a statement. She was not winning a moment. She was simply being exactly what she has always been, in exactly the place where she has always been it. The world noticed, finally. It always takes the world a little while to notice Princess, and she is not the kind of person who waits for it. She is too busy working. Into part 3.